out there every day. What is this, Miami Beach?
Not hardly. And, you know, you can expect hazardous travel later today with that, that blizzard thing.
Oh, that blizzard thing. That blizzard thing. Oh, well, here's the report. The National Weather Service is calling for a big blizzard thing.
Yes, they are. But, you know, there's another reason why today is especially exciting.
Especially cold.
Especially cold, okay. But the big question on everybody's lips.
Yeah, their chapped lips.
On their chapped lips,
Chapped
right.
lips.
Do you think Phil's gonna come out and see a shadow?
Punxsutawney Phil.
That's right, woodchuck chuckers. It's Groundhog Day! Get up and sit that hog out there! Yeah! Come here, Groundhog!
And yes, tomorrow is Groundhog Day. Hi, I'm Jeff Williams, your host of North Star Oasis. We're here for another jam-packed, action-filled information overload just for you. Please go to our Facebook and YouTube channels if you want to see more. Facebook.com/North Star Oasis and YouTube.com/North Star Oasis. Here we are, Groundhog Day. And what are we seeing out of the Madden-Julian Oscillation? What are we seeing out of the atmospheric angular momentum drop? Well, according to Joe Bastardi, we're due to get another cold spell any time now. I'm not going to really get into the weather too much, other than I did enjoy our January thaw, but looks like that's about to end here pretty soon. So we're going to get into another cold spell, and then we're going to actually start seeing spring eventually here within the next few weeks. That's one of the things about Groundhog Day. You know, if he sees his shadow, it's, 6 weeks of winter. If he doesn't, it's 45 more days till spring. It's the same thing. But anyhow, we have some other stuff coming up, stuff that happened last week. But before we get into last week's news, we're going to show you our Prager University segment, and that's going to be from Dennis Prager on the key to unhappiness.
How many times have you heard someone say they want to make a better world? It is a noble sentiment, but very hard to achieve, right? Well, actually, it's quite easy. All we have to do is increase just one human trait. This trait is so powerful that it alone can make people happier without working on their happiness and make them better. And by better, I mean more generous, more honest, more kind, more everything good, without a single lesson in morality. So then, what is this one almost magical thing? Drum roll, please. It's gratitude. You can't be a happy person if you aren't grateful, and you can't be a good person if you aren't grateful. Almost everything good flows from gratitude, and almost everything bad flows from ingratitude. Let's begin with ingratitude. Here's a rule of life. Ingratitude guarantees unhappiness. It is as simple as that. There isn't an ungrateful, happy person on earth. And there isn't an ungrateful, good person on earth. There are two reasons. Reason one is victimhood. Ingratitude always leads to or comes from victimhood. Ungrateful people, by definition, think of themselves as victims. And perceiving oneself as a victim or perceiving oneself as a member of a victim group may be the single biggest reason people hurt other people, from hurtful comments to mass murder. People who think of themselves as victims tend to believe that because they've been hurt by others, they can hurt others. And the second reason ungrateful people aren't good people is that ingratitude is always accompanied by anger. The ungrateful are angry, and angry people lash out at others. If ingratitude makes people unhappy and mean, then gratitude must make people happy and kind. And so it does. Think of the times you have felt most grateful. Were they not always accompanied by a feeling of happiness? Weren't they also accompanied by a desire to be kinder to other people? The answer, of course, is yes. Grateful people aren't angry, and they don't see themselves as victims. The problem, however, and it's a big one, is that in America and much of the rest of the world, people are becoming less grateful. Why? Because people are constantly told that they are entitled to things they haven't earned. what are known as benefits or entitlements. And the more things that people think they should get, the less grateful they will be for whatever they do get. And the more angry and therefore unhappy they will be when they don't get them. Here are 2 rules of life. Rule number 1, the less you feel entitled to, the more gratitude you will feel for whatever you get, and the happier you will be. Rule number 2, the more you feel entitled to, the less happy you will be. That's why, for example, children who get whatever they want are usually less happy children. We have a word for such children, spoiled. And no one thinks of a spoiled child as a happy child, and certainly not a kind one. The more that you feel that life or society owes you, the angrier you will get, the less happy you will be. As a result, we are increasing the number of angry, unhappy, and selfish people. The other way we are making people unhappy, and even meaner, is by cultivating a sense of victimhood. People are constantly told that they are victims because of their upbringing, because of past prejudice against their group, because of material inequality, because they are female, and for many other reasons. Next time you want to assess any social policy, ask this question first. Will this policy increase or decrease gratitude among people? You will then know whether it is something that will bring more goodness and happiness to the world or less. If I were granted one wish, it would be that all people be grateful. Gratitude is the source of happiness and the source of goodness. And the more good people and the more happy people there are walking around, the happier and better our world will be. If you have a way of achieving such a world without increasing gratitude, let me know what it is. I'm Dennis Prager.
And that is today's Prager University segment. Keep that in mind when we take a look at something that happened last week. The doomsday clock is now at 2 minutes to midnight. Yeah, literally, it happened last week. And when you take a look at gratitude, that also includes taking a look at gratitude or ingratitude towards the type of leadership we have, which is, I believe, what this is directly in reply to. I do believe that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists are making their statement against President Trump. Even though they're not officially saying it, I think that's really the unwritten rule, trying to make the president look bad because the doomsday clock inched further, closer on his watch. So let's take a look. Oh yeah, for absolutely no reason. But let's take a look at the video and let's see what they had to say.
It is 2 minutes to midnight. To call the world's nuclear situation dire is to understate the danger and its immediacy. We considered the ossified state of arms control negotiations and non-proliferation agreements, as well as new testing undertaken by North Korea, nuclear exercises built into Russia's military plans, and an enhanced commitment to nuclear weapons in Pakistan, India, and China. We considered at length the lack of predictability in how the United States is thinking about the future and future use of its own nuclear weapons, and unpredictability that it is embodied in statements and tweets by the President of the United States.
The nuclear arsenals of all of the major weapon states are being updated and imbued with enhanced capabilities. Trump administration's nuclear posture review appears likely to increase the types and roles of nuclear weapons and U.S. defense plans and to lower the threshold for nuclear use.
U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control is a key element since both countries together still possess about 95% of the world's nuclear weapons. And without bilateral progress, there is little incentive for others to move forward. However, for the first time in many years, in fact, no U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control negotiations are underway. And if the draft U.S. nuclear posture review is any guide to U.S. policy, there will be no U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control negotiations for the foreseeable future. Instead, we could see a return to a nuclear arms race.
If governments are not acting to protect you as they should, you need to take the lead. You need to demand action. It is not yet midnight, and we have moved back from the brink in the past. Whether we do so in the future may be in your hands.
This is the doomsday clock.
Okay, so they're concerned about India, Pakistan, and China. Let's see. Pakistan got nuclear weapons in May of 1998. India got nuclear weapons in 1974. And China got nuclear weapons in 1964. This is 2018. They've had them for a while. This is nothing new. Unpredictability. I think we had a lot of unpredictability during the Obama administration. I mean, take a look at the Russian Federation under Putin moving into the Crimea and Ukraine regions in Europe. I think the whole situation with North Korea is pretty untenable, and that was already an issue during the Obama administration. I think the nuclear deal with Iran was helped by President Obama. Why didn't we move the nuclear or the doomsday clock up then? I think we should have, sometime in 2010 or 2011, probably moved it up to about 1 minute to midnight, because we had an enabler-in-chief who helped lead us to that point. But no, this is all politics. It's all about Donald Trump's tweets and left-wing scientists not understanding what he's doing or why. That's all it is. Now let's take a look at the history of the doomsday clock, and I think you might see what I was a little bit clearly about what I was just trying to tell you.
It was designed back in 1947 by artist Martel Langsdorff, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists sets the clock to show how much time we have left until midnight. Midnight in this case meaning nuclear Armageddon and the end of humanity. In January 2017, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists revealed that the clock ticked 30 seconds closer than last year to the end of times, and cited, among other things, climate change, cybersecurity, nuclear weapons, and Donald Trump as causes. At the announcement, Executive Director of the Bulletin, Rachel Bronson, said there were two concerns that stood above the rest.
The first has been the cavalier and reckless language used across the globe, especially in the United States during the presidential election and after. And the second is a growing disregard of scientific expertise.
Cold War and world conflict have influenced the clock's time over the years, but disregard for scientific expertise by global populist leaders, including an American president, has never been cited as a doomsday factor. That said, the newest changes to the clock are the smallest in its history, meaning doomsday, thankfully, isn't necessarily any more imminent. So how accurate is the doomsday clock? And why was it made in the first place? The doomsday clock first debuted in 1947 as a graphic on the cover of the first edition of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists magazine. Artist Martel Langsdorff was married to Alexander Langsdorff Jr., a Manhattan Project scientist. Langsdorff and other concerned scientists founded the Bulletin 2 years prior, feeling a responsibility to warn and educate the public about the possibly disastrous consequences of their creations. Atomic bombs had been used for the first time in 1945, killing 130,000 residents of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Initially, the time on the clock depicted the hour hand pointing straight at the 0 hour, with the minute hand placed at just 7 minutes before midnight. The time was completely arbitrary, though. Langsdorff just thought it seemed the right time. The graphic quickly adopted the name of the Doomsday Clock, and eventually gained world recognition as a symbol for the threat of an impending nuclear apocalypse. Since 1947, the Bulletin has regularly adjusted the clock face when they perceive a change in threat level, also taking into account other non-nuclear factors like climate change, bioweapons, and cyber threats. Doomsday seems just a few ticks away now, but time on this clock doesn't really reflect actual time, nor is it particularly linear. In 1949, the Bulletin set the clock to 3 minutes until midnight due to Soviet Union nuclear testing,
Truman's dramatic announcement that Russia had the atom secret,
and to 2 minutes until midnight in 1953, thanks to the US developing the hydrogen bomb. But a decade later, the clock turned back to 12 minutes before midnight, thanks to the US and Soviet Union ending atmospheric nuclear testing.
A milestone in '63. East and West banned the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere.
The minute hand has continued to fluctuate through a range of minutes before midnight since then, from 7 minutes till in 1968 thanks to Vietnam, to 10 minutes till in 1972 at the signing of the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty.
This is not an agreement which guarantees that there will be no war. But what this is the beginning of a process that is enormously important.
To 3 minutes till in 1984, thanks to the heightened tensions between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
None of the 4 wars in my lifetime came about because we were too strong. It is weakness that invites adventurous adversaries to make mistaken judgments.
And all the way back to 17 minutes till in 1991, after the end of the Cold War and the signing of START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty.
Whether about issues on which we agreed or disagreed, the spirit of candor and openness, a desire not just to understand, but to build bridges, shone through.
In every case, dangerous or potentially dangerous events dictated whether the minute hand moved closer to or away from doomsday. But 2017 is the first time since the Cold War that the Bulletin expressed deep concern about the disposition of an American president towards science and nuclear weapons.
First of all, you don't want to say take everything off the table.
No, just
you're
nuclear.
a bad negotiator if you do
Just
that.
nuclear.
Look, nuclear should be off the table. But would there be a time when it could be used? Possibly.
Okay.
Even though the outlook seems grim, it's important to remember what the time on the clock is really meant to show. It's not doomsday yet. And on this clock, we can turn back time.
So in other words, what does the doomsday clock really mean? Absolutely nothing. It means absolutely nothing. Because if you take a look at it where if it's doomsday at midnight, it's not going to matter. We're gone. Nuclear war happens and catastrophe comes. We're done. Who cares? The clock won't even be in existence. If it's 17 minutes to midnight, who cares? If it's 30 seconds to midnight, we're not at doomsday yet. So all of this is really big to do about nothing. It's turned into being the only way that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists can actually remain relevant in the news cycles. And in this case, they choose to use that power to politicize the whole doomsday thing because they don't like a president. Otherwise, it's completely meaningless. But we've been here before. It's Groundhog Day. Speaking of Groundhog Day and being here before, we've been here before. February 7th, 2015, we did a whole show on Groundhog Day. So, in the spirit of Groundhog Day, we're going to show you a clip from that show. Talking about Groundhog Day with other people, because nobody talks about Groundhog Day anymore. It used to really be a very big tradition. Yes, you still see the clips on ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News, and CNN, but it's like that one day, okay, this is the Groundhog, it's always about Punxsutawney Phil, and then nobody else cares, and then we don't care, and then there's nothing really going on here in the Twin Cities area to observe this. So why is this even a big deal? And where did this tradition come from? And those are the questions that I was having. And I started asking around to other people that I knew, do you know why we observe Groundhog Day? And ever since the 1993 film that we saw the intro clip with Bill Murray, ever since that came out, nobody knows. We're saying, I don't know, why do we look at a woodchuck in the middle of winter? What's the significance of that? And so I've done some digging, and that's why I was actually putting some notes together when I had to pull up my Christmas clock. And the origins of Groundhog Day, believe it or not, actually goes back to the Gospel of Luke. No, the Bible does not mention a woodchuck, or as we call it, a groundhog. But it comes from the verses 22 through 40. I am going to read this. I don't normally read scripture on air, but I'm going to do this for the sake of the historical context of this particular segment. When the time came for the purification rites required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him, Jesus, to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. And this is the New International Version. Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for the revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel." The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. Then Simeon blessed him and said to Mary, his mother, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too." There was also a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Penuel, the tribe of Asher. She was very old. She had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple, but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at the very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became very strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. Now, if we keep in looking at the basis of the Jewish law, 40 days after the birth of any newborn was to be consecrated at the temple. And in Leviticus chapter 12, verse 8, which is where we can find the Jewish law, it states that if she cannot afford a lamb, she is to bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for her and she will be clean. Essentially, Mary and Joseph were poor, and because they were poor, this is the chapter of the law that they fell under, and so they went to do the offering of the 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, the burnt and the sin offerings. And so that's really where everything starts. If you look now, as church tradition has taken on, and especially when you had the feast days, Christmas actually was a feast day, December 25th. It was a feast day. By the time we got to the Reformation in the 1500s, even Martin Luther, who was rising up against the Catholic Church, trying to incite some reforms to the church, he wanted to abolish all feast days, including Christmas. And ultimately, over time, Christmas was one of those feast days that kind of stuck around. But there is still another feast day that the Catholic Church observes, and that is the presentation of Jesus at the temple. And February 2nd is considered to be that day in the church calendar year for that presentation. So February 2nd, 40 days after Christmas. So we have Jesus being presented at the temple. And so we are actually going to show a quick video here that just kind of accentuates what I just told you.
The next account, found in Luke 2, though not as well known as the appearance of the angels to the shepherds, is the presentation of Jesus Christ in the temple 40 days after he was born. According to the law of Moses, a woman was considered unclean because of the blood that was associated with birth. Anytime anybody touched blood in any way, they were considered unclean. If you touched a dead body, if you helped somebody that had been wounded, you would be considered unclean for 7 days. On the 8th day, the child, if male, was circumcised, and they were given a name. 33 days later, for a total of 40 days, the woman was to come to the temple and offer a sacrifice to complete the cleansing process because of the birth of the child. The woman was to offer a lamb and a turtle dove or a pigeon as part of this sacrifice. And if they didn't have enough money, they were able to offer 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. We know that Mary and Joseph must have been poor because of the fact that they were only able to bring 2 turtle doves. Next in the account, we learn of Simeon and Anna, who come and find the baby Jesus. Simeon had been waiting on the Lord and was a righteous man who was looking for the signs of the Messiah. When he saw him, he knew who he was. Likewise, Anna, who is called a prophetess, when she heard the words of Simeon, immediately knew who Jesus Christ was. We read of her that she served God with fasting and prayers night and day, and she, coming in that instant, gave thanks likewise unto the Lord, and spake of him to all them that looked for redemption in Jerusalem. The interesting thing is how both of them respond. Simeon responds by praising God. Anna responds by telling everybody around her, giving us the example of how we as disciples of Christ should act. We should be looking for the signs of the Messiah. We should be looking for the signs of his second coming. And as we learn about him and as we hear more about his teachings, we should be willing to tell everybody around us.
So, there's the presentation of Jesus at the temple. Now, what has that got to do with Groundhog? Well, what happened with Christmas is that with Christianity, a lot of pagan rituals were blurred with Christian events. And by the time we got into Europe, the 16, 17, 1800s, there was another observance that occurred at the same time that was merged in with the presentation of Jesus at the temple. And the most common one is called Imolc, which is a Gaelic festival, so from Ireland, that it marks the beginning of spring. And it was commonly held on the 1st of February and is halfway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. So when you get that halfway point, we'd say the halfway point of winter is when you had this big festival. And part of this secular tradition, of course, I don't think anybody really knows where that tradition had its origin, but that's probably the most common one that we have. In Ireland, it's now called St. Bridget's Day. But it also spread throughout Europe, so I'm sure that it was more than just the Gaelic festival. And part of that was where the whole tradition of having a badger or a hedgehog or some other type of animal and the meteorological aspect of whether you see your shadow and it's going to be cold winter, warm winter, all of that really came out of that midwinter tradition that was going on throughout Europe. Again, I don't know when it started, but that's really where you start seeing the blur between the two cultures. And so when it came to 1841, that was really the earliest reference in America that we have to the groundhog. It was first documented, the first American reference to Groundhog Day can be found in a diary entry dated February 4th, 1841. And it was in Morgantown, Pennsylvania. And the celebration really did begin. It was brought over here to the New World, America. It's a Pennsylvania German or Pennsylvania Dutch custom, and it's found largely in southeastern and central Pennsylvania. 17, 18, 1900s. This is where, again, its origins are in ancient European weather lore. The badger or the sacred bear is the prognosticator, the similarities to the pagan festivals. And James Morris, a Pennsylvania storekeeper in 1841, he wrote, "Last Tuesday, this second, was Candlemas Day." Candlemas Day is the presentation of Jesus at the temple. It's more known by the presentation than it is Candlemas. But he writes, "Last Tuesday, the second, was Candlemas Day, the day on which, according to Germans, the groundhog peeps out of his winter quarters, and if he sees his shadow, he pops back for another 6 weeks' nap. But if the day be cloudy, he remains out, as the weather is to be moderate." And then when you're merging these two things, this is where we start getting traditions. Now, one of the reasons why it's the groundhog, or more commonly known probably up here as the woodchuck, simply because at that point in time in Pennsylvania, they were all over the place. There were plenty of them to be found. I'm sure that the woods were so populated that you could probably trip on them on your way over to the local town. When you're walking your 3 miles barefoot in the middle of winter one way just to get to your one-room school shack. You'd find groundhogs everywhere. I mean, just like, at least here in the Twin Cities, I see rabbits all the time. If you drive you come into your driveway in the middle of the night, and there's 2 or 3 rabbits that are dispersed as soon as they see the lights of your headlights. That's the way groundhogs were in the 1800s or the 1700s here in America, in Pennsylvania. They were all over the place. And they resembled the hedgehogs in Europe. So it was natural to take something that looked like a hedgehog, and then we got this thing, we'll call it a groundhog. It's not a hedgehog, but it burrows into the ground. And so that's where you start getting this whole groundhog mantra. And so with that, we're going to take a look, what exactly is a groundhog, and what does that groundhog do? And so we're going to put a clip together here. There's actually, I thought was well done. It was put up by the Missouri Department of Conservation. Let's go to the clip.
How much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? 700 pounds! That's how much soil woodchucks dig out to make their underground homes, and how much scientists figure it would take to move the same amount of wood. Woodchucks are the same as groundhogs, which are rodents and the largest members of the squirrel family. They're the only animal with their own national holiday, which is also the most watched weather forecast each year. There's an old legend that on February 2nd, if the groundhog comes out of his burrow and sees his shadow, there will be 6 more weeks of winter. If no shadow, then he will come out and begin looking for food for the spring. This tradition comes from a time when people lived closer with nature, and they paid more attention to when animals awaken in the spring. It would be rare to see a groundhog in Missouri on Groundhog Day, since winter is usually only half over then, and they are still hibernating. Groundhogs gorge all summer on greens, fruits, and veggies to build up fat reserves. After the first frost, they go underground in burrows and into a deep coma. Their body temperature drops and their heartbeat and breathing slows way down. Months later, when the weather gets warmer, their inner clock wakes them up. Groundhogs are known as great home builders, and their underground dens are about 20 to 25 feet long. Skunks, possums, foxes, weasels, and rabbits use their burrows too. Groundhogs are about 20 inches tall and weigh about 12 to 15 pounds. They have short ears, tails, and legs. Their jaws, limbs, and front claws are very strong. Mostly seen on the ground, they can also climb trees for fruit and swim. They aren't bothered as much by insects, germs, and past plagues because they are very clean animals. Even in their burrows, they have a separate tunnel for a bathroom. Their thick, coarse hair has been used for tying trout flies and their hides for the soles of Indian moccasins. They have also been known as whistle pigs for the sharp sound they make when frightened. Their enemies are foxes, bobcats, and humans, especially when they invade people's gardens. They live about 6 to 8 years in the wild. In April or May, mother groundhogs have about a half a dozen young. These are called kits, or cubs. The best chance to see groundhogs in Missouri is in the spring, summer, or early fall, in open fields near woods or backyard gardens, while they try to feast before their underground famine. Happy Groundhog Day!
I'll bet you didn't know any of that, unless you happen to have been a groundhog keeper. Hey, I was able to, while we were looking at that clip, I was able to actually find the reference of how the tradition spread. This actually comes from groundhog.org. The Roman legions during the conquest of the northern country, which part of it would have been Ireland, or what we now know as Ireland, supposedly brought this tradition to the Teutons, or Germany, who picked it up and concluded that the sun made an appearance on Candlemas Day. An animal, the hedgehog, would cast a shadow, thus predicting 6 more weeks of bad weather, which they interpolated as the length of the second winter. Pennsylvania's earliest settlers were Germans, and they found groundhogs in profusion, okay? They found groundhogs in many parts of the state. They determined that the groundhog, resembling the European hedgehog, was the most intelligent and sensible animal, and therefore decided that if the sun did appear on February 2nd, so wise an animal as the groundhog would see its shadow and hurry back into its underground home for another 6 weeks of winter. Now, by far and large, the most popular groundhog that is known to be in existence is Punxsutawney Phil. As a matter of fact, Punxsutawney Phil was named after King Philip, who was the son of Massasoit, and led King Philip's War in the Northeast and New England back in 1675, 330 years ago. So that's where Phil got his name. But now let's take a look at the way traditions are still currently held. We're gonna show a sequence of clips here that go with Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York City. First, we're going to show you what happened to him last year.
There's gloves and then there's gloves. Now these are gloves. Staten Island Zoo official gloves here. Try getting through these, Chuck.
Now, John Franzreb will sound the official Groundhog Day horn, signaling. Ladies and gentlemen, young Nick Romagnola is going to present the scroll to the mayor once Chuck makes his prediction.
Come on, Chuck, it's all going to work out.
Now take a look at this. Oh, and Mayor de Blasio drops the groundhog. Actually, a little later here, you'll hear a couple of kids say, "Oh, drop the groundhog, drop the groundhog." Well, he dropped the groundhog. And like a good politician, he recovers. In 2009, and this is why he wore those big gloves, 2009, then New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg was bitten by Staten Island Chuck. So that's why they had brought out these big, thick gloves So that way Mayor de Blasio wouldn't be bitten like his predecessor 5 years prior. So here's the mayor with his big gloves. And if you held anything like a wriggly cat, and this cat does not want to be held, or any other type of animal, and they suddenly decide that they're going to go and do whatever they want, well, that's what happens. Whoop, there goes the groundhog and he falls. The mayor, I think, does an okay job of recovering here.
Turn this way.
And this, I want to remind you, was last year, not this year.
What about this winter thing? We can work something out, can't we?
What about this winter thing?
And there he is. Drop him again.
I've been brushing up on my Groundhog dialect, but I didn't fully understand what Chuck said, so let's see what the scroll tells us. Everybody ready? Oh, I'm sorry to say we have troubling news here. Chuck likes the polar vortex. Chuck says more winter. Chuck has spoken, everyone. It's a cold, hard reality, but live by the groundhog, die by the groundhog. That's right. She's been wrong 20% of the time. Maybe this will be one of them. All right. There it is. The truth. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you for your honesty, Chuck.
Chuck is a girl.
Well, Mayor de Blasio, you live by the groundhog, you die by the groundhog. Well, the mayor dropped the groundhog on her head, and she died a week later. Now, it really made some ripples over the summer because people didn't find out that, one, that groundhog was not Chuck. They called the groundhog Staten Island Chuck, but that was a female groundhog. I believe the name was Charlotte, who is considered the granddaughter of Staten Island Chuck. So nobody said anything about the death of Charlotte, the replacement for Staten Island Chuck. So then the question, of course, is what happened to Staten Island Chuck? And then there came allegations. And let's just show you one of those. The national video clips we'll show you right now.
All right, a shadowy accusation against New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. Have you heard about this one? Is just coming to light. Days after de Blasio dropped the famed groundhog on Staten Island Chuck back in February. He dropped it.
He meant
We are now learning, oh, that's evil, that the critter met his demise shortly afterwards. Brian Kilmeade.
Well, let me just give you the facts. February 2nd, the drop happens. He falls to the ground. We know he's not the same. We don't know really what's wrong. On February 9th, he passes away on injuries sustained from the fall. A couple of things come to mind. Number one, it turns out that he was posing as a male, but he's actually a female. His actual name is Charlotte.
Chuck is actually Charlotte.
And number two...
Can we see the drop again? Can you re-rack that for us?
And
is that it?
One of the keys is, this is a...
Oh!
This is
awful.
Well, this is a 6'9" mayor. That's a huge drop. Had Mayor Bloomberg dropped 4'11", he would have not been injured at all, and they would have survived.
Well, if he'd have held on to it, it wouldn't have been Island here. We wouldn't have been hurt at all either, would he?
I don't want to judge, but I would say like this: why are we finding out about this 8 months later? If a groundhog dies, we should know about it
instantly, and all of the circumstances around it. Maybe we need a special investigator.
I'm deeply, if I were Punxsutawney Phil right now, I'd be quite concerned because I understand he's taking a trip down.
I demand to wear a Velcro suit on Groundhog Day. Hold on to me.
It is so sad.
It is very sad. I don't know how we're going to know next year whether spring is coming or not.
Well, not.
But I wonder if there'll be a massive cover-up. I wonder if maybe the groundhog wasn't paying enough taxes.
Well, that's true. That could be it. The other thing is, Melissa,
I'm just saying it could have been meant as an example to the rest of us.
Melissa, the other thing is we know groundhog seeing their shadow means how long winter doesn't last or not last. But the thing is, the groundhog does not have to be alive. Why not use the same groundhog again?
Very good.
Because we have to see a shadow. He doesn't have to see a shadow.
I don't know about that one. All right. From all of this groundhog intrigue, and I'm sure that there's going to be a big investigation, I do want to draw your attention back to markets right now.
So there you have it. Groundhog Gate is officially what it's been termed. That the mayor drops the groundhog dies, and the polar vortex last year continued on and on and on. And we didn't have spring in 6 weeks. It felt like we'd have spring in 6 months. And now that we're back through another Groundhog Day, I'm only feeling now like I thawed out from last year. So, I think now maybe the weather cycle as they replace the groundhog in Staten Island may have actually, worked. But now let's take another closer look at Groundhog Gate. And actually the unions in New York started this on Twitter and calling it Groundhog Gate. So let's take a replay of Groundhog Gate.
Groundhog Gate. Rest in peace, Charlotte. We hardly knew ye. Earlier this year, on February 2nd, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio became the first mayor ever to drop a meteorologically astute rodent. Of course, everyone wanted to know whether spring would come early or not. Chuck came out, but of course saw his shadow. That may have been one of the last things it saw, actually. Or maybe he just thought the mayor was a fox or something. At any rate, Butterfingers de Blasio dropped him. What we didn't know was that the little guy, or actually girl, her real name is Charlotte, Chuck being a stage name and all, didn't make it and died a week later. Groundhog Day next year will be a bit different, we bet. And so will the rest of Bill's mayorship.
We're going to take a look at is how did the city of New York. Okay, well, there we have it. A little history on Groundhog Day now, with Groundhog Day being tomorrow. I'm wondering if New York Mayor Bill de Blasio is going to drop another meteorologically astute rodent. I guess we're going to find out. Just a few more hours here, and we'll find out exactly what Bill de Blasio does. And I think since that, there was a politician in Wisconsin who was bitten by a rodent on Groundhog Day. So we'll see if Punxsutawney Phil and any of his cousins go out and start biting people or getting dropped on their heads. I mean, this is the way it's turning out, folks. People don't know how to do that. They need to be tough and competent, as we discussed last week. So here we are at Groundhog Day with the doomsday clock 2 minutes to midnight. Again, we've been here before. So I don't know really what I'm going to be doing tomorrow for Groundhog Day. And I guess I'm going to have to stop on both Groundhog Day and the Doomsday Clock. Sunday is the Super Bowl. And once again, the Minnesota Vikings, the Doomsday Clock should have said, just kind of like, Vikings will go to the Super Bowl when hell freezes over. Well, they'll go to the Super Bowl when the Doomsday Clock strikes midnight. They were getting closer, but in Groundhog Day terms, this turned out, the NFC Conference Championship turned out to be no different than 1998 or 2010. They keep missing it. So again, we've been here before. This is just that cycle and pattern repeats. Now, I will say for football parlance, it seems that whenever the Vikings end up not making it there, the Packers kind of really overcompensate the next season. So for Green Bay, this might actually be a hopeful sign. So who knows? I will say this, that this is Super Bowl week, and I'm having fun. And we've even had the Super Bowl here before. I mean, what was it, 1992? Minneapolis Super Bowl 1992. Yeah, it was January 26th, 1992, so that anniversary would have been last week when Super Bowl 26 was held here. And now here we are, 26 years later with Super Bowl 52. Again, this is Groundhog Day. So 26 more years, we'll get the Super Bowl again. That's just kind of how it goes. But hey, you know, Timberline Productions held their halftime spectacle for Super Bowl 26, and that actually changed the game. If you remember, we had a snowman dance, a snowman on skates with dancers around, and it was probably one of the most hokey halftime presentations I've ever seen in my entire life. And after that, they started improving the quality of the product. One can argue that the halftime shows have gotten a little bit stale now that they're going constantly to the latest pop audiences. You know, Justin Timberlake coming up this year. You know, why don't they ever have a country music artist? I don't think they've had one in at least a decade, probably closer to 20 years now, when Shania Twain and Garth Brooks led the halftime show. You know, we've had Beyonce twice, Bruno Mars a couple of times. Now we're getting Justin Timberlake. Can we change outside of the millennial generation? You know, for the Gen Xers, we get like nobody. We had to put up with the crappy stuff in our childhood, and then we automatically skip over our Gen X generation, and we move right on over to the millennials. You know, we're people too. I'm going to argue on behalf of my generation. We want... Well, I mean, let's bring in REO Speedwagon. Let's bring in Kiss. Let's bring in somebody that, well, I was going to say Slayer, but they're retiring now. That's the other thing, you know, for Gen Xers, a lot of our music, you know, our people are retiring. I mean, we're losing Neil Diamond, who was just diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Elton John is hanging it up. Slayer's going away. I don't consider that to be too big of a loss. Motley Crue retired. Kiss is kind of semi-retired. They come and go as they please. And what do we put up with? Bruno Mars and Beyonce and Justin Timberlake. And that's what we got to look forward to in music. You know, I think we can even do better than that with the U.S. Army Field Band, and that's what we're going to play right now with their rendition of the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Mine eyes
Producer, I'm your host, Jeff Williams. You're watching North Star Oasis, Groundhog Day Edition 2018. Hope you enjoyed the North Star Oasis National Holiday, and reminding you there's 326 shopping days left until Christmas. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.